This is a recording of a presentation given in October 2022 to a visiting delegation from Nigeria. Features of an efficient expropriation system. I'm going to talk about expropriation. In the UK, we call it compulsory purchase. In the USA, they can say exercising the rights of eminent domain. And compulsory purchase itself is, to me, being always a strange term. The authority, the acquiring authority, is not compelling itself. Rather, it has chosen to exercise these powers. Somebody is compelled to sell. So I think this is why also now we hear the term compulsory acquisition. I think in some cases it might be the preferred term. Now, new infrastructure projects require three ingredients, that is construction materials, a labour force, and land on which to build. And this last one, this land, is not often not owned by the government or the acquiring authority. It has to be purchased, and in many cases the owner is going to be unwilling to sell. Now, there's a long recognised right of the state to take property in these situations, and national laws, typically rooted in human rights legislation, provide for just compensation for the affected. The use of compulsory purchase or eminent domain powers has often been controversial. Sometimes there's negative effects. Obviously, at the lower end, there's a basic interference with private or community life. And at the other end of the scale, there can be wholesale destruction of livelihoods, some of the issues that we'll look at in this presentation. So a quick overview. This presentation is an extract from some research that I undertook last year based on this question: is the expropriation regime a hindrance to the development of new infrastructure? And actually, I applied this to one single country in Europe, Romania, which was having difficulty at the time of in delivering new infrastructure. And the answer to that research was basically yes, but with some reservations. The process was one where I looked at as much as I could internationally to look at the idea of best practice across the world, and in particular, Central and Eastern Europe. And this was in order that I could develop a framework that could be applied anywhere to test how efficiently that particular compulsory purchase regime was working. My research actually started with three basic questions. What are the causes of unsatisfactory outcomes in the expropriation process? How do valuation professionals engage with the expropriation processes? And how can the legal mechanisms be improved to avoid delays to the delivery of new infrastructure while ensuring satisfactory outcomes to stakeholders? Now, the conclusion of this research led to the development of 5 more general qualitative indicators to access expropriation regimes. And this is what I will focus on. I think I used the term issues, but there's a lot to unpack and explore with each. But really, these can also be called indicators. So what were they? These qualitative indicators, these issues? Well, the first one was property rights, then suitable land registry, then full compensation. The fourth one is the resettlement and protection of vulnerable or marginalized groups. And finally, the fifth issue is the fifth indicator, transparency and consultation. I'll talk about each of these in more detail, giving my thoughts on each. Now, at the start, I have to say there was a bit of an issue with existing literature. The body of literature was broadly divided into 2 categories, one being published advice from transnational bodies, and by this I refer to the various organisations such as UN agencies, the Food and Agriculture Organization, or international development banks. Both the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the European Investment Bank, these publish best practice advice for expropriation, mostly concentrating really on safeguarding rather than, say, the other end, the methods of calculating compensation. The second category of research is academic work. Sometimes it could be cross-border studies comparing different regimes. There is a huge variety of research available. Unfortunately, it's not all being systematically considered. One thing I discovered was that researchers tend to really look at expropriation and compulsory purchase on a desktop basis. considering the law as it is written and without looking at how it is practiced. Things might be good on paper, but in reality, there could be issues and problems. Also, I did say one thing that resonated with me, one was rather striking, is an issue with the existing literature is there was very little contemporary research into the topic by built environment professionals. Most of the research seems to be done through the lens of sociologists, perhaps lawyers, very little done by surveyors, and I use this term broadly, of course, to include geomatic experts, cadastral scientists, as well as my own background of real estate valuation or appraisal. There's very little from what I would say my point of view, and that means there's a risk that some practical issues of interest might be given less importance. One thing I think it's worth saying is, I include this a lot in my slides, is equivalence. The term is hugely important in compulsory purchase and leads to a lot of debates and compensations, and the principle of equivalence itself is well understood, that affected party should be no better or worse off after the event. For my research, I actually consider this as the principal test of whether or not compensation was adequate. It doesn't tell us how well actual mechanisms work and those factors that might impede full compensation being awarded. So I think I'll just get stuck into looking at those indicators. The first one being property rights, somewhat actually connected to the second issue, second indicator, which I'll look at shortly. For now, though, property rights refers not just to freehold ownership rights or usufruct rights, but also tenancy and license rights. The literature shows that there's always going to be a problem in getting compensation to those who do not have strong rights to the land they occupy, and there may still be a duty of care, or rather, there must certainly be a duty of care on behalf of the government to those who occupy land but without title. So that point there is the strength. The first point is the strength of property rights, and obviously economies need defined property rights to function. Where land rights are non-transferable, where they are insecure, where they're incapable of legal enforcement, land cannot be used efficiently. Occupiers need secure rights in order to invest, to develop, or to lease their property. And I think when there's a total absence of private rights, then users are often not interested in preserving the land or resources. Perhaps they don't try to improve the land. Actually, they have no security of ownership over it. There can also be a failing in the ability for the state to use that land to collect taxes or allow planning authorities the ability to use that land efficiently. Good governance really is what we're talking about here, and requires some degree of legal flexibility, I'm sure. Many forms of tenure in different countries. In much of the developing world, there are modern laws that establish rights. Often you'll see that all land is vested in the state, and looking at in particular West Africa and in Nigeria, to whom this talk was originally given, there the state governor's department controls the land for the benefit of the nation. It's done on a state-by-state basis. Often we can see that property rights might not be fully exercised or registered. Sometimes the land title shows the name of a deceased owner. If the descendants failed to register the land under a new name, land might previously have been confiscated by the state and returned, but it can be competing claims, meaning ownership could be messy. And a lot of my research experience obviously was looking in Central and Eastern Europe, where most of the countries were formerly under communist regimes who perhaps maybe took the land from individuals whose families had maybe held land for hundreds of years or later returned to descendants. And there may have been arguments therefore over ownership. And the World Bank's actually recommends identifying even those who do not have formal rights, as this will reduce problems later when trying to actually expropriate the land. I mean, this really at this stage, the authorities with the determining rights, they should really be looking at all users of the land, even if they have no right to it. So next point, indicator or issue is the suitable land registry. Following on from the first issue, of course, for an expropriation system to work efficiently, property rights need to be registered in an accessible database. This should show who holds ownership, as well as any other rights such as servitudes, easements, or mortgages. The issue slightly differs from the previous indicator in that it considers the quality of information, recording and retrieval of this information rather than the mere existence of rights in law. World Bank guidance actually says that registration of land should be transparent, accessible to the public, and affordable. Otherwise, the poorest segment of population may choose not to follow the process, not to engage with the processes. The cost of registration needs to cover the cost of operating, of course, the land registry and the various services provided. And a land registry is considered crucial to improving security of tenure rights. Although the mere existence of a land registry does not always mean that it's kept up to date or that it is reliable. And there could be many reasons for inaccurate records: human error, poor system management structures, high costs that act as a disincentive to submitting updates. We have to think also maybe about the time and cost to register. Say the time and cost to register a land transaction. It might be relatively straightforward to purchase land or a house. How long will it take to get the legal transfer done, and what cost? Is there a stamp duty, registration fees, or other associated expenses? Now, I looked at the World Bank's ease of doing business report. The most recent one was in 2020. I saw the World Bank has stopped producing these and is going to replace them with a new publication. Anyway, this is a very good source of information as to how property rights operate in various countries. And ahead of this presentation, I looked at in Nigeria, there was going to be a move towards a computer-based graphical information system to accurately store and record cadastral information. Although so far this was only implemented in one state. Now, I think the United Nations research shows that, or states that electronic registry that can be accessed remotely also improves land governance by making it difficult for officials to act corruptly, such as imposing illegal barriers to information retrieval. Electronic records can be shared easily with planners, lawyers, mortgage providers, those who decide what to do with or work with new infrastructure. And this helps facilitate property transfer and therefore should reduce associated costs. Some countries, maybe I've missed this point out, some countries actually have multiple registries. It can be, such as looking at countries, again, in the Balkans in Europe, countries have risen and fallen, joined and broken up with others. It can be several different cadastral and registration systems, and many of which are in different languages. You can see when this is true, an expropriation system can be more complicated and a lot less efficient. And again, we'll come back to that human resource point. How well trained are the operators, the people in cadastral and land registration departments? They're civil servants usually, possibly underfunded. Many would argue that they're certainly not paid well enough or even on time. That's the experience I've seen in Central and Eastern Europe, where politicians might attempt to save money by reducing staff, and that the staff there can often, can be highly trained, can make a lot more money in the private sector. Now, the third issue or indicator is full compensation. Really, I'm thinking now about the methodology of valuation and what is compensatable. Is land taken, the only criterion for compensation, or is the reduction in value to remaining land also claimable? Can disturbance costs or associated with purchasing replacement property be reimbursed? And as I mentioned before, the general principle is equivalence. That affected party should be no better off or worse after the expropriation than they were before. The issue itself of full compensation can be further broken down into maybe 5 problem areas. That is calculating compensation, the methodologies used to estimate the amount the stakeholder receives. You know, talk about that. I mean, in many countries, the issue is that the compensation may not be based on market value, but rather on a statutory formula or value registered in a cadastral register. This might be practical in that there are not enough sales of land to demonstrate a market, but also means that dispossessed owners may not be getting fair compensation. And also that brings us to the second point here, adequacy of compensation. Is that amount received enough to properly compensate the affected persons? And this, of course, goes beyond monetary compensation. It can also include, is anybody left at risk without adequate housing, or if affected parties have been moved off their land, given new land, but might now be far from their places of employment or the fields that they farm, or there might be some other sort of economic deprivation. There's also going to be a risk that that sum offered is the lowest that an acquiring authority believe they will get away with. They're perhaps hoping that the affected parties will not go to court to claim more money. For rural farmers, grazers, hunters, other landholders whose land is a primary source of income, then, you know, accounting for that land's economic activities and improvements in the assessment of compensation is going to be particularly crucial. And obviously, when rural farmers are cultivating and selling crops in their lands, expropriation may leave them without a source of income. A source, that brings me to a point about a recent study by USAID looking at Rwanda, found that 77% of expropriated households surveyed experienced income loss after their property was compulsorily acquired. Another example, I think, is the World Bank's LGAF, I think it's Land Governance Assessment Framework study of Brazil. They found that compensation in Brazil was generally paid for ownership and other rights, use rights, access rights. But in the majority of cases, that level is insufficient for the displaced households to either afford comparable assets or maintain their prior social and economic status. Now, the next point is title. We talked about title in the previous issue. Again, the law may require good title to receive compensation, and therefore there's a risk of full compensation not being achieved. The next one is a loss due to severance. Possibly a minor point compared to others, but it seems to be that often affected parties would be compensated for land taken, but not for any injury caused to remaining land. That land might have lost development value through being left in an unusual shape, maybe harder to farm, or maybe separated from other land that it was held with. And the authority may not actually guarantee accommodation works. One high-profile example is this picture, this photograph here. This is a family who were affected by a new motorway extension in Western Romania, who felt the compensation was not going to be sufficient to find a new home. And actually the county court agreed, ordering that compensation be more than doubled. Now, the highway authority, who were taking the land, appealed and said, okay, if it's going to be doubled, then we're just going to take a smaller portion of land. We're going to take only 800 square meters out of the total 1,300 square meters, leaving that family with 500 square meters. This took away their home. They're actually left with something like a stable and a summer kitchen. The children having to sleep in the car until the local authority rehoused them, a responsibility that really should have been the highway authorities. They also claimed that the land they were left with was unusually shaped, something like a fishtail in form, making it difficult to use. They also lost fruit trees without any compensation, and that now they're in a position where they suffer from landslides. And the final issue I want to mention is the robustness of process. And this is one that's maybe the most interesting, as the conclusions here were actually driven by my primary research interviews with market players and data gathering rather than from existing literature. So I'm actually going to talk about this in more depth on the next slide. So what do I mean by robustness of process? Not an issue, not an indicator, rather it's a sub-issue. but it's worth having talking about in more detail. And by this I mean, how suitable are the mechanisms? Are they able to stand up to all situations? Can they be applied effectively to more unusual circumstances? Well, the research shows that in many cases, no. There are wide variations in practice. Firstly, there's a lack of consistency in compensation calculations. And I think it would be better to specify market value of total land loss, as well as any other incidental losses or professional fees. And from my research, I believe that it makes sense for compensation actually to be agreed earlier in the process, perhaps with an opportunity for affected parties to make complaints or counter offers prior to court involvement, as the courts are really busy enough and the process can be lengthy and uncertain. Affected parties are actually often unaware of their rights, and solutions suggested this would be to engage with the stakeholders early on in the process, send out information brochures, hold meetings in local town halls or community centres, etc. So really the law here should be should maybe specify, and the law should establish and specify that compensation is also independently assessed and applied fairly, with compensation paid promptly. Now, this photograph here shows something called the Tuturica building in Alba Iulia in central Romania. Here, the local authority gave notice to some owners that their properties would be expropriated in order to build a car park. Local authority owns some social housing, giving many inhabitants only a few days' notice, and some of them had apparently nowhere to go. Rehousing provision was unavailable, and some had to camp in front of the building. There were something like 70 apartments and 216 affected people. Maybe around 30 of those apartments were privately owned. And compensation to those owners was actually somewhat low, between €2,300 and €4,000, a fraction of the €30,000 that would be the actual minimum cost of an apartment in this city. And you can imagine the situation where vulnerable people now, there's only redress is to sue the local authority, while having no legal home or address or means to instruct a lawyer may have difficulty actioning this. Actually, and I noted that in July, August this year, compensation was increased, and the mayor saying over the summer that they now expect banks to sue the City Hall as some of these properties were mortgaged. And it makes you show a little bit of investigation at the start, considering whether the process was going to work. Looking into the actual rights over these might have uncovered this problem earlier on in the process. Now, moving on to the fourth indicator or issue, resettlement and protection of vulnerable or marginalized groups. I think that last example kind of demonstrates what some of the issues are when about compensation when affected parties are deprived of economic liberty. Now, specifically, we look at the resettlement of vulnerable and marginalized groups, recognizing that there may not be other social safety nets to ensure protection. In situations where the expropriator takes housing, a simple one-off payment to cover value and perhaps disturbance may not be sufficient. There may also be a safeguarding issue. And of course, where international financing institutions such as African Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, etc., where they are involved, this will be paramount, as evidenced by the importance that the various guidelines placed on ensuring those who are losing their homes have a suitable place to live. There are various definitions of vulnerable and marginalized groups, but typically would refer to the elderly or disabled, low-income households, members of minority groups, unauthorized occupiers of property even, maybe those who have constructed buildings illegally, and they could be those who are economically dependent on land that will be affected by a scheme. And I mean, one practice here in Europe, they traditionally prefer, or countries traditionally prefer, giving cash as payment to the expropriated. This is because the authorities typically do not hold a reserve of land to provide as an alternative. And state-owned housing has often not been a priority, with existing stock undersupplied and often in a poor condition due to neglect. So the World Bank's Operation Manual covers the involuntary resettlement, and it's a leading authority. And what they actually say is that, to begin with, involuntary resettlement should be avoided or minimised. And again, as what I mentioned with the robustness of process above, the best practice really is to consult with communities in order that they may participate in the early stages of resettlement, as in ongoing monitoring. The World Bank's operation manual explains that access to legal processes, of course, may be difficult for those who are disabled, elderly, part of a low-income household. They may not be able to travel to local authority offices to obtain correct tenure documentation, or provide rights of ownership, or even submit grievances. And the issue is often that this is not seen as a responsibility of the expropriator. I interviewed one local planning official in Romania who told me he didn't care, it wasn't his job. He just decides where they're going to build the infrastructure and what property they're going to need to expropriate. There'll be other teams that deal, and of course, this risks what we call an unsatisfactory outcome. Now, on that same point, I mean, from research, so there's 3 reasons why compensation may disproportionately affect marginalised groups. And I kept this slide originally as a discussion in my previous presentation, but now that I'm just narrating what it says, there's no scope for discussion. But of course, the first is that poor and marginalised groups may be disadvantaged by legal systems that base compensation on fair market value. What we mean is that we often value or sort of the European Western approaches to value may not appreciate what fair market value is when we look at religious, spiritual, cultural, social goods, or even environmental value. I mean, often it's not recognised and not valued. The World Bank says we should account for non-market values to be accounted for, but frankly, as a valuer myself, I'm not really sure how you can put a price on cultural or spiritual value. Now, I've read about some research from Vietnam where there was tribal communities. I think their land was needed for mining operations, and frankly, no amount of money could replace the religious value of holy land, ancestral land to those people. Secondly, compensation eligibility requirements may preclude communities with customary tenure rights. They may be precluded from submitting claims for compensation. This is where, under some national legal frameworks, customary or tribal tenure rights might not be considered legitimate, and procedures to regularize title may be difficult for these people to access. It could be costly and time-consuming for such communities. The example I looked at, actually looking at Romania, where the average monthly wage in some rural communities was the same as the cost of registering. You'd find that some who owned land say, well, I've always had this land, I've always farmed this land. The communists took it away from my grandfather. I've got it back. Everybody knows it's my land. Why should I now pay money to have it registered? Why should I pay a whole month's salary to have it registered as my land? It's already my land. Actually, globally, up to something like 2.5 billion people hold land under customary tenure. So it's not an insignificant amount. It's also estimated that nearly 70% of the world's land is not registered, and only a fraction of the world's land is actually legally recognised as owned or controlled by Indigenous peoples and local communities with customary tenure. It's estimated by this decade, by 2040, it's not this decade, by 2040, so but in under 20 years' time, Africa alone will be home to something like 1.8 billion people with customary tenure. And out of some of the research I looked at showed that out of a study, I think it was around 50 countries, only 7 of these provided in law for compensation for those with customary tenure rights. So the third reason here, women may be disadvantaged by gender neutral compensation procedures. There are some guidelines, what are called VGGTs, the Voluntary Guidelines on Good Tenure, I think it stands for. They say that states should promote gender equality. Women should enjoy all human rights, of course, but in many countries, females do not have equal tenure rights. States are advised to adopt gender-sensitive approaches to governance, paying attention to gender aspects and the needs of the poor and vulnerable. And actually quoting from that guide when I say compensation procedures may place a disproportionate burden on women landholders if procedures do not establish special protections ensuring women are appropriately compensated. Women in rural areas, of course, are very important to sustaining societies, but compared with men, often only have a fraction of land rights, particularly in patriarchal societies, where compensation might only be paid to male heads of families. Needs of women and children can be ignored. Money somehow can just vanish to the detriment of the family's health and welfare. And when compensation comes in the form of actually new employment opportunities, often these are sort of jobs that favour men. So the final issue or indicator is transparency and consultation. It's really a recurring theme in the research, along with the concept of stakeholder participation. It's expected that prior public consultation can help build trust in the acquisition process, ensuring cooperation. And my European research revealed that in laws often the authorities are not required to consult with anybody, not required to consult with the public ahead of expropriation or even inform those affected of their legal rights. Moreover, any information that was provided is often considered insufficient. If those threatened are unaware of their right to challenge the proposed amount, they may not receive the full value of their loss, and sometimes evaluation reports can be confidential. Solution to this, of course, proposed by the World Bank, is to draft a brochure outlining the procedure and explicitly stating the rights and obligations of each party, including how to dispute the action or the amount of offered compensation. And this would vastly improve the transparency in the process and build trust. And the example in Romania I used above, some residents found out that they were being forced to leave their homes with 20 minutes notice. And some only found out in local media. Public participation in that decision-making process is really then as integral to sound governance and decision-making. And it's true for implementation and subsequent monitoring. Surveys, assessments, they're recommended for the early stages of the process as a prelude to drafting a stakeholder engagement plan, and there should be care and sensitivity when disclosing the project to the community, both to reassure and to manage expectations. One example you can have is like meetings with local civic associations, focus groups, etc. These can answer initial questions while gaining a better understanding of any concerns. It could be possible, maybe, that communities can be invited for site visits to previous schemes, if practical, and of course there should also be a built-in mechanism to handle grievances. And this is why I put sufficiently funded court system here. And that takes us on to the end of this presentation. I'm going to look at recommendations, and mostly these have been talked about. Of course, laws should ensure that compensation procedures respect and protect the tenure rights of poor and marginalised groups. Laws should establish procedures that ensure a comprehensive valuation of compensation, accounting for all the losses borne by affected populations. Laws should establish measures that ensure compensation is promptly paid and objectively assessed. And this final one at the bottom is really one that is a recommendation from the land governance assessment framework looking at Nigeria, where there should be an establishment of a national land commission. And that's maybe not relevant to other countries, what such a National Land Commission would do, and it would exist to provide technical assistance to the various bodies to ensure that land sector management, or good land management, good land governance is undertaken. And that's the end of the presentation, and thank you for listening.